So today I'm going to show you how to prepare and stitch down all the shapes for the applique window on the Blithe Bucket Bag. So the technique that I'll be showing you to prepare these shapes is called the Starch freezer paper method, because it uses liquid starch and freezer paper as a template, which you then paint the starch around the edge of the shape and press that with an iron to make a template that's nice and crisp. And of course this is only one of the ways that you can do needle turn applique. There's also traditional applique where you can just trace the shape and turn the edge under with your needle yourself. And there's several other methods where you can use an bondable fusible interfacing that just stays inside the shape, and this gives quite a nice loft to it. But I actually really love this technique because it's really good for fiddly little shapes, and if you know a few of the methods and tricks to get this to work, then this is a really good tool to have in your arsenal if you're going to be appliquing quite small shapes like the ones that are going to be here. So if you haven't already printed out your template, then go ahead and print this out, and then just measure this scale square here just to double check that you've got this at the right size. And as you can see here, we've got 6 shapes here that we'll be using, so you can use up to 6 colours for this design, but my preference is actually to use just 5 colours generally. And of course this is totally up to you. You can even do this just all in one colour fabric, and that would just give a really nice effect as well for what you're making. And if you add some top stitching with some hand quilting cotton, that would be a really nice effect as well, and just change the look quite completely. I thought I'd show you the fabric pool for the bag that I'll be making today. So I'm going to be using some Tilda fabric from the Chic Escape line. So this is going to be the main exterior fabric that I'm going to use for my bag. And what I like to do when I find a fabric that I really love and it's got some really pleasing colours in it, I will use those colours to be the inspiration for the central window of what I'm doing. So I've got 5 colours here that I've drawn from the lovely floral print here on the fabric. And one of the tips that I like to have here is just make sure you've got a reasonable contrast between what you've got here, just so your work doesn't all blend into sort of and get lost in the design because the colours are too close. And as you can see, I have got these 2 greens which are pretty close, but the way I'm going to use these is I'm going to put this light green on top of the teal blue here, and that in itself creates a nice contrast so that these 2 greens are not lost in amongst each other. So this is going to be my lining, and this is going to be my casing and the trim on my flap and my handles. So just go ahead and cut yourself a 5-inch square from each of these colours here, and then we'll get on with preparing the background fabric. So here I've cut quite a large square for my background fabric, and as you can see, this is a fair bit larger than the shape of the window that you're going to need here. And this is just a really good idea to do because you're going to be appliquing onto the fabric and giving it a fair bit of use and wear. You're going to be fraying these edges, and sometimes it can just shrink a little bit as well. So I do recommend cutting this a couple of inches bigger than what you're going to need. And I've also got a cut of SF101 to back this fabric, and this just adds a really lovely stability to what you're doing, so that it really just stops the shrinking of the background fabric, so that everything sits nice and smoothly and you'll be really happy with the final result. So just go ahead and press your fabric and then fuse the SF101 onto the wrong side of your background fabric, and then this is all ready to trace. So just going through the things that you're going to need to make this panel. So we've got our background fabric with our SF101 fused on the back of it. I've got my template printed out from the pattern, and you can find the pattern in the link in the description below. I've also got this page printed as well, which is just another really handy method if you're going to be using the freezer paper method that I'm going to be demonstrating. I've got a piece of freezer paper that you can also find in the link in the description below. I've got my spray starch, and you can use liquid starch if you have this as well. And this is just a supermarket variety brand of starch, and it works really, really well. I've also got just a shallow little dish to spray my starch into, and I've got a really narrow flat bristled paintbrush to paint the starch onto the seam allowance of the shapes. And this one is actually even narrower than 1/4 of an inch. So this just really helps control the amount of starch that you'll be putting on, and is pretty perfect for the seam allowances that we'll be using. And I've also just got some old paper scissors for cutting out the pieces of paper so you don't ruin your fabric scissors. And of course I've just got my proper sharp fabric scissors for cutting out the fabric. Now I've also got a friction pen here for tracing my design. So if you're not comfortable using a friction pen, just choose a fabric marker that you're comfortable using. So you're going to need one of these to trace the design. So there's 2 ways that you can prepare your background fabric for your design, and the pattern tells you both of these. So the first way is you can rule a 4 3/4 inch square, and then rule diagonal lines from corner to corner, and then one through the center of that and one across the horizontal, and that can give you just a rough ballpark of where to place everything, and all the design is going to fit inside that 4 3/4 inch square if you just follow the printout for reference. If you would like a slightly more accurate way to do this, and this is the way that I prefer, is I will just trace the design lightly with my pen. I just do little dashes just to go around everything, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but it gives you a pretty good reference for where to put everything. And if you can't see this very well, you can trace this over a backlit screen like an iPad, or you can hold this up to a window, and that can help as well. Okay, so now we have this done, we can just set this aside and we will get to preparing the individual shapes that will stitch onto this. So what I've done here is I've taken my glue stick and I've glued this freezer paper onto the wrong side of the paper so that it's covering all of the shapes that you can see here. And I've made sure to put the glue on the matte side, not the shiny side, because we want this shiny side to stick to the fabric that we're going to iron it to. So go ahead and do that, and then you can cut out with your fabric scissors each of these shapes, and then we'll be ready to fuse them on. So my number 1 tip for getting successful needle turn with the freezer paper method is to cut as accurately as you can. So if you've got a curve, you want to make sure that you've got no pointy edges or no straight bits. Go back and trim it. So if you see any bits that you're not super happy with, just go and just shave a little bit more off until you're pretty happy with a nice even shape. And you will improve as you practice this. It's just like kindergarten where you learn to cut out all over again. So just go nice and slowly, just follow the outside of that line as accurately as you can, and that is definitely going to help you succeed in getting a nice smooth edge to your template. Okay, so I'm going to fuse these shapes with the shiny side down onto the wrong side of the fabric, and make sure you leave a little bit of space around it to allow for a seam allowance to be cut out. And then you can use a bit of steam with this if you like.
So just go ahead and cut out all of those shapes as accurately as you can.
That it's actually fused, and what you can do is hit it again on the other side. So just space out what you've got here. Make sure that you're leaving some seam allowance space here. And what I'm doing is putting these on the diagonal to try and make as much use of the bias on the fabric as possible, so that when we go around these curves, the fabric is going to mold itself to the edge of that template as closely as possible. So whenever you're going to place your shape, just have a think about where the curves are on the shape and just try and maximize the bias that you've got there. So hold it there till you can see that it's fused really well, and then flip it over and just give it a press from the other side, just to make sure that it's really stuck nice and thoroughly. Okay, so I've gone ahead and fused all of these together. So I've got my small circle on my pink fabric here, I've got my large dewdrops on the teal, I've got my love hearts on the dark pink, and I've got my small dewdrops on the light green, and my large leaves on the dark green, on the light green, sorry. So we're going to start by cutting out the largest shapes first, because these are going to be the least challenging. So just grab your fabric scissors here, and you can just cut around this a bit roughly to start with. Just cut them apart. So when you're cutting something out, always try and do a rough cut first, and just cut it close to where you'd like it to be, and then this just helps the least amount of drag that you would have when you're cutting, so that you're going to be as accurate as possible. So when we cut this out, we're just going to leave a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I do find that if you're having problems getting a nice smooth edge here, then it's usually because you've cut your seam allowance too large. So just make sure that you're cutting this quite thin, and if you've not cut enough, just go back and trim it down even a little bit more. It's probably good to actually cut it a little bit bigger than you think to start with. So that would be about right. Might just trim a little bit more off this side. Now I'll go ahead and cut out one of these leaves now. So I'll just start with the largest one. So you're just going to eyeball this and keep it really quite narrow. So my rule of thumb is the smaller the shape, the smaller the seam allowance, and obviously this doesn't work forever, but you can really push this depending on the weave of your fabric. You can get quite a small seam allowance before you would be in danger of fraying happening on the edges of this. So don't be afraid to cut it really quite small, And because it's just such a small shape, if you find that you accidentally do cut it a little bit small, you can just peel it off and fuse it on again on another piece and just cut it out and start again. So we'll just cut out our heart here. And then last but not least, we're going to do this tiny little circle and a tiny little dewdrop. Now these are even a fraction smaller than the circle, so these will definitely be the most challenging part. A very narrow seam allowance here. So just experiment with what your fabric can cope with, because some fabrics definitely fray more than others. Okay, so now we're ready to start fusing. So just go ahead and shake your starch up. And spray some into your little dish that you've got ready. And it's going to bubble up, so you're just going to let that foam subside. Okay, so I've let my starch foam subside, so I've got a nice amount of liquid here. And my trick here is, if you're really new at this, start with the largest shapes that you've got and work your way down, because you'll definitely improve as you go along. So just dip your brush into the starch, and we're going to paint this along that seam allowance. And you need to get your fabric pretty wet here, but you're really aiming to not soak the edge of the paper, because that's going to mean that you end up with quite a squishy edge, and you'll lose the effect of actually having a template here. Okay, so I've got this painted and I've got my iron here. Now, do you need a little iron? Not necessarily. I have done this for years using my big full-size iron and I haven't had a problem. But one thing I do recommend is that you turn off your steam, otherwise you're very likely to burn your fingers. So just keep your steam on. And if you like, you can do this technique using a little stick, just to keep your fingers out of the way. So what I'm going to do is just pull that seam allowance up to the edge of that template where I can feel that rigid edge. And I'm just going to press a really small amount at a time until I can see that that starch is drying. And then I'm going to pull it in with my finger, and I'm going around a bit of a curve here. So you do want to sort of stretch that seam allowance and get it to warp around the edge of that shape so that you can get it to mold around what you're doing. So just work slowly. Just use the very tip of your iron. And if you find that you get a little pucker or a little pleat in it, that's okay. You can actually go back again when you're done. And paint a bit more starch on it. Now as you come up to here, you're going to want to tuck in this little seam allowance that you've started with. So make sure that this is folded up inside it, and when you come up to this edge, just fold that and tuck it in. It's alright if it sticks out a little bit, but just do your best get that all inside. Now I'm pretty happy with that. Turn that over and I've got this pretty crease free. I've got a little point here at the top here. Now if you're being really fussy, you can get rid of that just by painting a little bit more starch on that again, and then just spreading that little bit out with your fingers again, and you can get rid of that little pucker. And you can see that that's even smoother now. So if you find that the first time you go around you've got some jagged points, never fear, you can go back and repaint them and rework your shapes just by pulling and manipulating the fabric as you go around, and you'll find that you will do fine. So the next shape I'm going to work with is the heart, and because this has got an internal point, I'm going to need to snip into that point up to the edge of the paper, just so that when we fold this fabric it's going to open out into that point and be able to press flat. So just go ahead and paint your starch around the edge again. When I start with my heart, I like to start on one of the bottom straight edges. This is the straightest part of what we're doing. So you're just going to be pulling and tucking in this seam allowance, and just doing your best to avoid those little puckers. So you'll be quite surprised at how easily your fabric does mould around this template once you've had a little bit of practice. It is quite thorough. Now as you come up to that internal point, just pull it as tightly as you can, but don't worry too much because it is going to fray a little bit and you're not going to be able to help that right now. What you are going to do is when you come to stitch that down, you'll be able to poke that centre down inside the shape a bit more and make sure that all those fraying edges of that point are nicely covered. So I do find that this little iron just does help a bit more to avoid getting my fingers burnt, just because it's not quite so heavy and I've got just a little bit more control than I would normally have with my bigger iron. There we go, turn it over and have a look. And I've got a nice smooth heart that I am pretty happy with. Now I'm going to move on to the big leaf. So this one has got quite a tight curve at the top here. So this one's a little bit tricky. So just start on the bottom edge where the point is and turn over that whole seam allowance, so starting right on the edge there. Then as you come up to this tight curve, you're just going to pull a bit more of it in at a time. until you can see that it's sticking nicely, and then just work your way around and just tuck all that in as best as you can. So you're going to have a fair bit of fabric all sort of folding into one point here, and that's okay. So there's my first large leaf done, and I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, I'm going to go down to the small leaf. So same process, fold over the first edge. Make sure that it's extending right to the edge of that seam allowance there. And then just work your way around, tucking and pressing, doing your best to make sure you've got a smooth edge there. Now you can see that that little seam allowance has actually really helped that be a nice smooth shape. So that's looking really cute and it's nice and smooth. So the second to last one is going to be centre circle. So this one you're just going to have to tuck and fold the tiniest little bit at a time. So if you think you need a little bit more starch, just re-wet it again. Now let's have a look. So that's pretty fiddly, but I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so this is the smallest shape that we've got here. And it's probably the most tricky. But the same techniques apply. So we're just going to start tucking on that straight edge. pulling it around as you go. Nearly done. And you can see here that this is looking pretty cute and pretty smooth, and I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so now you can just go ahead and baste all of the rest of your shapes. So now I've got all my shapes nicely basted. I'm ready to start stitching these down. So you're going to just need a strong fine polyester thread like superior bottom line thread or Invisifil, and this is just really helps the thread disappear into the seam allowance so that you can't see it any of your stitches. So you don't need a lot of colours, but this can be quite useful. As you can see, I don't actually have all the colours that match the fabric that I'll be using here, and that's okay because this does work really well just even in a very neutral colour. So you're going to need a needle, and I like to use one that has the smallest eye that I can still thread comfortably. So this is a milliner's needle, probably about size 11. I've got my EPP glue stick that I just use for tacking the shapes down in place until I can stitch them in place. And I've got my scissors. So that's all you need to get started. So I'm going to get started with the center circle here, and it really doesn't matter where you're going to start here. I just find I like to do similar colours all at once so that you don't have to stop and change your thread too often. So just carefully remove the paper out of the shape. Try not to disturb the seam allowance too much. And then I'm just going to put a little dab of glue into the centre of that circle, and then just place that in the centre as close as you can, and make sure all those raw edges are tucked underneath. Just give that a really good push, and that'll just tuck that into place for you. So you're not going to need very much at all for this shape. And I like to thread my needle with back loop. You can see that in the video I've got linked there. And just thread that around. Together so that then you can stitch with one downward thread and remove your thread. Thread and then put it down exactly into the background fabric right next to where I came out, and then come out again exactly on the edge of that seam allowance. Pull that tight and go back down into the very edge and come out again on the seam allowance. And because this is a little shape, I'm actually going to be making my stitches fairly close together. So if it's a large shape, I tend to applique about 1/4 inch apart each stitch, but this one I'm probably doing that more like an 1/8 to 3/8.
Now when you get to the end, just going to place your needle back down right through the background fabric and pull it firmly, then flip it over and we can tie a knot back up against the back there, and just double and triple knot that. Trim that off. So there we've got our circle done, and I'm going to move on to one of the love hearts. So now I've got my needle all threaded up with a different colour, so just carefully remove the paper from inside of here. Just do your best to not disturb the seam allowance. Grab your Applique pen and just put a bit into the centre there. Just to tap that in place, and then just centre that down over what you've traced there and push it into place. Now I like to start this just down on the point of the bottom of the heart here. So just come out exactly on the bottom edge there, back down right next to the point of that heart there into the background fabric, and up along the edge of the seam allowance, and work your way around. Now as you come up to the internal point of the heart, you'll probably notice there's a few frayed edges just poking out there, so I'm just going to poke them with the point of my scissors, and you can use the point of your needle to do this as well. So just poke them in and pinch them between your thumb and finger and hold them in place. And you can come along with your needle and thread right down under that point there. And then I like to go right down through the background fabric and then right up on the very edge, very close to where I've just stitched again. Do a second stitch there just to reinforce that. And you can just carry on again. And that will very nicely tuck everything into place, and you won't have any raw edges showing there. So just continue stitching your way around there and until you get back to where you start. So the final part that I'm going to go through with you is how to tuck in this dog ear that you'll find at the bottom of some of these points. So I like to start just at the bottom, right on that point, come out, and then I do another stitch very close to the last one, and this is just going to help secure everything nice and tightly so that when we come back round to the other side, none of the dog ears that we tuck under are going to stick out, because we're going to be fitting quite a bit of fabric into this small space here. So I like to put my stitches fairly close together, just around here, and you can space them out again just a little bit more as you go around. Now as we come up to this bottom point, I'm just going to stitch pretty close up to where that dog ear is protruding, and then you can just take your needle, or I like to actually use the tip of my pointy scissors here, and while I'm still pinching with my thumb and finger here right on the point here, I just tuck those raw edges under and make sure they're really jammed in there. Just pinch with your thumb and finger, and then you can just put an extra stitch or two just to hold them all inside and keep everything nice and secure. And that's how we get a really nice sharp point with no raw edges showing.